Hello and welcome to Reality Check. Before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about our sponsor for this week. It's the iconic Chuck Norris, a guy I used to have on my bedroom wall. The martial artist hero who's still in his 80s and still kicking butt and still staying active. What's even more shocking is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and he even has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. He did this by making just one change, and he says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife even started doing this one thing too, and she's never felt better. She says she feels 10 years younger, her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. Chuck made a special video that explains everything. Make sure you watch it by going to chuckdefense.com/Ross. That's this link below this video. It will change the way you think about your health. Once again, that's chuckdefense.com/Ross. Now, let's get on and enjoy the show.
For too long, the American spirit has been dimmed by a veil of secrecy, by a government that has grown too comfortable in the shadows, denying us the transparency we deserve. But today, we stand at the dawn of a new era where the light of truth begins to shine through. A few weeks ago, President Donald Trump made a historic announcement. With the stroke of a pen, he committed to declassifying the files concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A decision not just monumental, but pivotal. It is with profound honor that I have been entrusted by Speaker Mike Johnson and Chairman James Comer to lead the House Oversight Task Force on declassification of federal secrets. This will no longer be a task force that makes bold promises only to fade into irrelevance or send strongly worded letters. This will be a relentless pursuit of truth and transparency, and we will not stop until the American people have the answers they deserve. We will be conducting investigations into the following: the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Dr. Martin Luther King, unidentified aerial phenomena, also known as UAPs, unidentified submerged objects, also known as USOs, the Epstein client list, the origins of COVID-19, and the 9/11 files. Our first investigation will be announced, but it's going to be covering on a thorough investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I can tell you, based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were two shooters, and we should be finding more information as we are able to gain access into the SCIF, hopefully before the files are actually released to the public. The biggest information problems that we've had with UAPs is the amount of stonewalling, stovepiping, and also it seems that there is this push to gaslight the American people into looking at the evidence and then not fully believing it. Why is it that members of Congress who are given a top secret security clearance are being denied access?
G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart, and today we're interviewing Matthew Pines, who's just taken on the role as Executive Director of a DC-based think tank called the Bitcoin Policy Institute, which is a non-profit that explores and researches the policy and societal implications of Bitcoin and cyber currency. But of course, that's not why we've brought him here today. In previous roles, he's advised the US government on national preparedness and emerging technology, and he's also served as Director of Intelligence for a geopolitical and cyber security consultancy. Matthew studied physics and philosophy at Johns Hopkins University and went on to earn a master's degree with distinction from the London School of Economics. He's also been conspicuous in his commentary and analysis on the emerging UAP mystery. Is there a cover-up? And in that capacity, he's taken on a role as a strategic advisor for Alex Klokus's ENEA Explorers Club, which includes Jake Barber's Skywatcher operation. And incredible as it may sound to the people that Matthew probably normally advises, Skywatcher has at its heart allegations that a cadre of people inside the US government and private aerospace have secretly colluded to conceal the recovery of non-human technology, alien craft, from public knowledge. Skywatcher is an independent, private equity-funded initiative that intends to prove something the Pentagon categorically denies that there is evidence of non-human intelligence engaging with this planet, and that alien tech really has been and can be recovered and hopefully reverse engineered, this time by good old-fashioned capitalistic private enterprise through Skywatcher rather than the dark forces of the so-called deep state. Matthew Pines, I have to say, firstly, welcome to Reality Check, and isn't covering UAPs one hell of a pivot from what you normally do in the sober world of national security?
Well, first off, thank you, Ross. I've admired your work and I appreciate you bringing me on to your show. It may seem like that, but my through line throughout my sort of academic and professional career has always been thinking about frontier subjects. When I was a young lad, I thought I was going to get a PhD in physics, maybe even a PhD in philosophy at the same time. So I was always interested in these more foundational and frontier questions, and then embarked on a career in national security where a lot of the analysis and work I did was focused on these what if questions. Like, what if there is a improvised nuclear device sort of terrorist attack? What if there is full-on nuclear war? What if there are crippling cyber attacks? What if you have global pandemics? These sort of low probability, high consequence events are things the government has to plan and prepare for. And so I did a lot of analysis exercises, operational experimentation to try to sketch out what that scenarios what those scenarios might look like. And so UAPs, right, as sort of fantastical they are, they sort of represent maybe the most high consequence and maybe prima facie low probability scenario, but which would have significant implications. And so even if you think it's unlikely, you have to take it seriously if there are credible indications as came to the fore over the past number of years that this is a scenario that can't just be dismissed. And so then wearing my normal sort of analytic national security hat on, this is a what if scenario that had to be addressed very seriously. And I think it's only become more pressing over the years.
I noticed, Matthew, that just a few days ago you tweeted the answers to questions that Lou Elizondo, a former senior Pentagon UAP investigator, answered back to the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability in the House of Reps. And I thought it was actually quite an important series of answers to the questions. Lou was basically asked by the committee, does any branch of the US government or defence contractors, aerospace and otherwise, possess technology derived from a non-human source? And Lou's always, he's a bit of a tease. He sort of sometimes swallows his words slightly and he's very careful. But this time he said quite definitively, ATIP engaged senior executives at DoD defence aerospace companies who claimed they possessed recovered exotic material not made by any US or foreign source. Because these executives indicated they could no longer glean additional insight from such material, they initially agreed to allow ATIP ORSAP to take control of the material. And he went on to talk about James Lakatsky, the former director of the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program, ORSAP, which basically talked about how there was an allocation of money for Defence Intelligence Agency, ORSAP, to go to a SCIF at Bigelow Aerospace due to a UAP material divestment plan proposed by Lockheed Martin Space Systems. Now, it doesn't get much blunter than that. That's pretty categorical, isn't it?
Yes, and I think it's an indication of where we are in kind of this divergence between the high fidelity alleged facts that paint a pretty stark picture of the reality of these retrieval programs, the reality of kind of the bureaucratic apparatus that has been constructed around them, and sort of the recent history of kind of evolution of that set of programs, and what you would call kind of the mainstream national security reporting community that doesn't seem to have picked up on that fact.
Who do you believe, Matthew? And I'm asking you for your personal opinion. Who's right and who's wrong? Is there an egregious cover-up going on inside what Donald Trump refers to as the deep state, concealing the existence of recovered non-human technology? What's your position?
I think it is very likely that we have recovered technologies of unknown origin as referenced in the UAP Disclosure Act, and that technologies of unknown origin refers to technologies that can't be associated with a known means of human manufacture, and that we've sort of prosaically termed non-human intelligence as the standard origin. And I believe that is likely the case.
If a man of your undoubted intelligence and capabilities comes to that conclusion based on the available evidence, what the hell's going on in Congress? Because this is really what I'm interested in getting from you, is you've worked in Congress. I noticed that you've got on your CV, you've worked for a congressman yourself. What's going on in the House? Because they're pretty junior people on this Nancy Mace, I beg your pardon, on this Anna Paulina Luna committee that's doing the task force into UAPs. Are we really going to see any moving of the needle with this committee that's been set up to investigate UAPs?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think in our modern American political environment, there's always a mix between the show, right? Things done for sort of mimetic intention to sort of draw attention and improve kind of the personal status of these individuals. And most individuals in American politics, fundamentally, they have to be celebrities to be reelected. And there's a lot of attention there's a lot of motivation that is about attracting attention and trying to carve out a niche, right? So that's just a fundamental dynamic in American politics at the moment. And I think there's a number of these individuals that have sort of seized on this topic as, their cause celeb. Now, that means there's always two levels going on. There's kind of what you would call more the trivial level, the level of social media, of attention grabbing announcements and, kind of somewhat hyperbolic claims, maybe even hyperpartisan claims. And then there's the second level, which is the structural level, which is this is a task force that's, duly convened as part of the House Oversight Committee. The chairman of that committee has said that he'll, support subpoenas if necessary, and that the subjects of their investigations are not just UAPs, but sort of a whole litany of kind of legacy historical discussions around, fraught issues, right? JFK, COVID origins, et cetera. Now, one critical dynamic is that these are the same party as the party in power, and the new officials that have been appointed and nominated to serve as, cabinet secretaries overseeing these different bureaucracies will be the subjects of subpoenas, nominally from members of their own party on the Hill. And usually that's not the way things work, right? Usually there's a level of comedy and deference and sort of cooperation behind the scenes. So one way this could play out is essentially these meetings, these hearings, and maybe documents that ultimately get produced are sort of provided voluntarily by the responsible agencies, and it's just a means of essentially front dooring or front facing material that they maybe would have otherwise a difficult issue kind of issuing themselves, right? And this is a convenient kind of bounce pass for some information.
Okay, Matthew, I'm going to promote you. I mean, you're an expert in national security and emerging technologies, and I've decided as the new president to appoint you as the National Security Advisor. And on the very first day that you get into the job at the National Security Council, a chap in uniform comes in, sits you down, and gives you the briefing on the legacy program. And he leans across, fixes eyes with you, and he says, "Sir, this is an incredibly sensitive national security secret. We have technology, we have weaponry, propulsion systems, energy systems that, yes, we have probably illegally kept from the knowledge of the Congress and indeed from the knowledge of previous presidents. But I appeal to you, sir, as the new National Security Advisor, to think very carefully about what you do now." What are you going to do, Matthew? What are you going to do? And I suspect that's happening in the White House right now. I suspect there's a decision being made. I'm told that the block is happening at presidential level, that previous presidents haven't been briefed, and that the approaches have been made by the Pentagon at National Security Council level. What are you going to do as a new National Security Council head, making that decision? What should we be taking into account?
Well, my first question is, how can you ensure that it won't come out in any other way? In which case, I'm facing a much bigger problem, right? Because if you can truly constrain the option set for me, which is either stays in the box like it has been for 80 years, and we can maintain unparalleled, strategic overmatch over our rivals while, keeping a fundamental asymmetry of knowledge with respect to society and a democracy that we would maybe feel uncomfortable with, but fundamentally it's sustainable. The question, if I'm not security advisor...
Whoa, I'm not letting you to get away with that one. So as the new National Security Advisor, you would heed, if you could get away with it, you would heed the request for secrecy. You would defer to secrecy rather than openness in the interests of protecting these technologies.
Well, so I'm trying to mentally model, like, say, Waltz, right, as national security advisor. And I know the questions he would ask is like, this is a false dichotomy, right? Usually when you're being briefed up by your underlings who are telling you, like, usually, they're framing an issue to try to box you into a certain option. And your role as a principal is to sort of challenge that false dichotomy, look for and make sure that there are all these options, being recommended to you that represent, the full spectrum, that you're not being sort of given a false choice. And so that's what I would do, right? Is sort of respond in kind to sort of break that false choice. Because I think ultimately you have, two equivalent responsibilities in that position. You have a responsibility to protect America, to protect its population, to ensure that it has a strategic advantage over its rivals in a highly contested world. And we believe our system of government, while flawed, is ultimately superior to many, if not most others. But on the other hand, you live in a democracy. And democracies fundamentally are only legitimate if they're accountable to the people, right? And there are certain secrets that are prudently and lawfully and ethically kept in the interest of national security. And there's certain information that's not inherently government information. The government has no legal or ethical or legitimate right to keep secret. And say the fact of non-human intelligence, I would hold, is not government information. It's not something the government can legal or ethically withhold. So I would want to make sure I'm cleanly dividing the sets of information here into buckets that are prudently kept classified and buckets that are morally and ethically, obligatory to disclose.
So if you as a national security advisor were briefed into the fact that NHI, non-human intelligences, have been engaging with planet Earth for however long, be it 80 years or millennia, would you accept the argument that's, I'm told, often made from within that national security establishment, that it's a slippery slope, that to reveal engagement by NHI with this planet is to also lead to the inevitable disclosure of technologies and weapon systems and energy systems that we would rather not disclose? Do you see it as an inevitable slippery slope?
I don't, but I would need to be convinced, right? Like, I don't see, like, the fact that, for example, right now, I've updated my beliefs on the fact that non-human intelligence is real and that technologies of unknown origin that manifest knowledge of physics and, therefore associated understanding of the nature of reality that is radically different than the sort of current theoretical frameworks that govern academic physics. But I don't know how to build those craft, right? So I have now reconciled my personal beliefs that there is a reality of non-human intelligence, and I think there's zero proliferation risk that is now generated as a result of me acquiring that knowledge. And I don't see how that doesn't play out at scale, right? Now, of course, over the long term, the world is the world is, right? And human science and knowledge ultimately seeks out and exploits the degrees of freedom that are available to us. That's what we call physics and science and technology. And so if the world just, allows a certain capability, it will be created eventually. And the role of government is to ensure that the technology is, harnessed for the advancement and security of all of our people. And I think, this is where it's a more philosophical question. Is there black balls in the big jar of knowledge? And if you pull out a black ball, is that inherently, dangerous knowledge? Is there such a thing as dangerous knowledge? I agree there is such a thing as dangerous knowledge, but that doesn't mean you never take your hand out of the jar, right? You go to, a sort of a Kaczynski approach to technology where we should all just be living in the forest. I don't think that's the right approach, but I think it's a false choice, right? I think we just need to break these false choices.
What do you think of the current national security advisor? Is he susceptible to the kind of pressure that we're talking about here, that the Pentagon might basically say, look, you're going to jeopardize an 80-year-old technological superiority that we've developed by revealing this? It would be irresponsible for the new president to even whisper a whisper of disclosure.
Well, I don't know exactly how he would respond. I think he's a former soldier. He has an intelligence background. He's a congressman. He's obviously made remarks about David Grush, taking him very seriously, taking this topic very seriously. I think he's also very sensitive to this idea of illegal, unreported, unaccountable programs, right? And this is a very much a policy priority of the Trump administration, is to ensure accountability in the federal government to the rightfully appointed constitutional officers. And so I think he would look askance at any claim that says, no, you can keep your special privileges and your autonomy. Now, there's a question of what would be disclosed. I think there's two big questions here. One is problem of accountability and a problem of disclosure. I think that the priority of the Congress and the administration coming in is to first establish better accountability over these programs and these activities to ensure they're properly briefed and they understand the ground truth, that there isn't these unreported, somewhat rogue programs that feel like they don't have an obligation to report and take direction from the commander in chief and to have oversight by the Congress. So that's like problem one, because you can't have disclosure without having accountability, right? You need to have the constitutional structures perform as designed by the framers. Then step two is, given sufficient briefings and establishment of accountability, full-throated, no holds barred, then I have to trust, right, our constitutional leadership to make the right decision on our behalf, right? But this is where the role of, well-motivated and proper whistleblower protections can kind of hold those folks accountable. And this is not just relying on one person to make the right decision, but relying on a constitutional process that's well-functioning and having a balance of power, right? Ideally doesn't lead to that sort of single point of failure. But this is not like a simple answer where it's just rip the Band-Aid off and everything gets dumped out. And I would want to know, the assessment is, how close is China, right? You say there's an unparalleled advantage that we need to protect. Well, is the current arrangement that has been established for 80 years actually leading to a strategic disadvantage? Because the way these programs have been compartmented, the way that the secrecy has been organized, and the fact that we can't get the best and brightest involved has meant that China's been able to catch up, maybe surpass us. And so this is an argument that is actually self-defeating for national security to kind of keep this behind the curtain.
You're now a strategic advisor, of course, for the NEO Explorers Club and Skywatcher. And the implications of that are that if Jake Barber's predictions do turn out to be true, it's entirely plausible, according to Jake, that he and his team will be able to summon and convincingly obtain proof of a non-human technology, possibly even within months. Do you agree?
I mean, these folks, if there's any group of people that I know of that can make that claim and not be laughed out of a room, it's these folks, right? And so I take their claims and their professional bona fides and their organization and their good faith efforts very seriously. It's why I've decided to advise them, because I think it's highly significant and unique, the effort that they're about to undertake, and it's fraught, right, with all these larger implications. And I think they want to and they are going about it in a diligent fashion. And this is ultimately what it comes down to: is you can either impress upon the government and work through these processes to try to get information released over time, and going through all the different bureaucratic and political filters, or you can just recognize, well, if there are non-human intelligence operating in our area, if they are susceptible to various means of interrogation and engagement, the skies aren't classified, right? Those means and methods aren't classified. The skills and capabilities of these people are now in the private domain. This is a straight path to bring information, high quality, high fidelity, censored data, including maybe material information, to civil society, to academic institutions, in a fashion that sort of bypasses these bureaucratic procedures and these political procedures in DC. And that's ultimately, just a parallel path I think that should be explored.
So let's talk about that hypothetical possibility. Let's assume Jake and his team and Alex, with the private equity investment that he's got, they manage to actually retrieve one of these craft. What happens in the White House at that moment? I mean, essentially, it's wrong footing the Defense Department and whoever it is in private aerospace that's covering this up, isn't it?
Well, it's hard to think through all the different details of that hypothetical. I do think that the Skywatcher team wants to be responsible in this and doesn't want to just create a whole scene for the sake of it, right? They want to do this in a responsible fashion. And I think there are folks in the government not associated with the legacy program that, feel the same way, right, about the activities that have been conducted where they were not properly read in, and that they feel that this is an interest of national security and it falls within their broader purview. And I think this is an opportunity to kind of, again, you can look back and there might be, a need for recriminations and criminal punishments and investigations on wrongdoing. But there's a separate path, which is, okay, like the government still exists and there are good people in different parts of the government that we need to help engage, civil society and basically do this the right way going forward, right? And so this is not about just doing it all, out in the wilderness or out on your own, but about essentially, stimulating and catalyzing the government to do what maybe they can't already do, and then finding new methods of, say, new institutions or public-private partnerships or structures where more collaboration and access to these materials can be facilitated by research partnerships, et cetera. To kind of, this is a much larger question than just any Skywatcher question. This truly requires building new institutions, new collaborations, new structures. And I think the government, we want the government to play a role in that. We want different, levels of government to play a role in that. That's a bigger project, but I think you need to sort of start small. And, this idea of making it plausible, right, as a first question, which was, probably prima facie very implausible until the Skywatcher folks came out, that it is conceivable to get, such materials without, getting it divested, say, from Lockheed. Well, that's still trickling out, and I think we wait to see, what that's going to trigger in terms of other new organizations and new efforts, and how the different parts of the government respond to those movements. And I think this is just the very beginning stages of that dynamic.
What do you think is the reason for the cover-up?
I mean, I guess the question assumes there's one. I think there's probably many layers of this. You could say that back in the 40s and 50s, this was tucked under, right, the Atomic Energy Act, secrecy provisions, and it was seen essentially as a potentially destabilizing, force for basic, social structures, which at that time were seen as, very hierarchical, right? The state was very powerful and strong. The institutions that managed this information were actually highly capable and technocratic, and also aligned with kind of the democratic state in the post-war environment. And I think everyone accepted that was a prudent, kind of legitimate thing to do, right? Especially in the Cold War era. And then you had, I think, an evolution and maybe a decay, maybe a structural institutional decay of those programs as sort of things became fragmented and sort of hyper competitive, almost privatized, right? And you got, that then generated an environment where maybe much less ethical, much less democratically accountable activities took off. And those never got reined in. And so they just compounded and pathologized like a cancer. They sort of grow until they kill the patient. In this case, maybe democratic oversight. And I think that's now, it's a irreversible process in terms of a certain institution. It gets to a state like that, and it's hard to come back. It's hard to sort of admit, right, that things went really wrong. And so just the inertia of let's just try to keep going and kick the can. And I don't want to get, the tail pinned on my particular donkey. I don't want to have to be hauled before Congress and explain all these things. I think that's like a narrow, parochial kind of human narrative, but I think it's also self-justified by, what might be motivated reasoning, but also might be well motivated in terms of a sense of caution about the disruption that could happen to society, to religion, to our economic and geopolitical order, and that this needs to be prepared and, slowly diffused into social consciousness over many decades through, say, different media formats and sort of cultural management, and that when the time is right, that the runway will have been foamed and we can sort of roll this out. I don't know how much I buy into that as a prudent motivation, but I think it's a mix of parochial CYA, as we call it in America, as well as maybe, earnest uncertainty about the risks associated with disclosure.
Let's roll back 62 years to JFK. It's quite clear whether UAPs had anything at all to do with JFK's murder or not. It's quite clear that JFK was interested in the UFO issue, mainly because of interdiction issues. He was trying to make sure that there was no possibility that UFOs could be confused for either a Soviet attack or an American attack and lead to an unnecessary nuclear exchange. There's a lot of talk that the president at the time was instructing the CIA to essentially move on this issue and become more open with the Soviets. And that, if I'm told correctly, that's the origin story for why many presidents have been kept in the dark about this. And is there any legitimate basis you could think of for why the commanders-in-chief of the United States Defense Force, the president, have been not read in as a matter of course to these programs? I mean, I know they haven't been in many cases. There have been presidents who've sought and been refused access to information about the program. Is there any justification on any kind of national security or imperative technology primacy basis that you can think of that would give the faceless bureaucrats and presumably private aerospace wonks that have made these decisions justification for such a decision?
Not if you believe in our Constitution, right? If you don't believe the Constitution holds that gives, the executive, all powers over the executive branch and unilateral authority to classify or declassify any government information. If you believe that the Constitution is just irrelevant, well, then, yeah, you can do whatever you want. But if you believe that and you are serving in the military or you're in a position of government responsibility, you're effectively abrogating your fundamental duty to the Constitution. So I don't see how any justified argument. I could see lots of self-motivated, somewhat cynical arguments could be given, but I can't see a politically or legitimate argument given.
Let's be, I don't know, let's pick a name. Oh, Curtis LeMay. Let's pick Curtis LeMay, for example, and suggest that perhaps he was one of the people involved in making the decision, maybe with, say, I don't know, Alan Dulles, then director of the CIA. Isn't it a good argument, frankly, Matthew? We know how much Congress leaks. We know how much congressmen and senators love having a quiet chat over a beer with a journalist. Wouldn't this have leaked if Congress had been read into the program? Isn't there a good argument that this ought, whilst there is an argument that it ought properly, constitutionally, to have been revealed to the Congress and to the President, the simple fact is that in reality it's been too big a secret to not conceal.
So it's funny, right? So the executive branch during World War II was systematically compromised at the highest levels and the deepest levels, to the point where Stalin knew more about the Manhattan Project than Vice President Truman did. They had spies and moles throughout the executive branch, the sort of, quote, hermetically sealed compartments that folks like LeMay felt they had, sole dominion over. And so there's the government, especially the executive branch, the intelligence community, they love to think they're really good at keeping secrets. And time after time tells us we're really not, right? But the architecture of secrecy is not to first order about keeping secrets, right? It's about bureaucratic control over information, right? Because we know and we operate sort of on the assumption that a lot of our information after a certain period of time is going to be known to the adversary. We just bake that in to our assumptions. And we know, especially if there's fundamental science knowledge, it's hard to keep that from a sophisticated adversary that has their own independent technological and scientific development and ecosystems. Like, there are special advantages you want to try to keep, little tips and tricks that you want to keep. Sources and methods are obviously critical to national security. We protect those, but we operate on the assumption that there are spies in our midst, right? And when you compartmentalize a program, you have to account for these different risks. And so, yeah, the Gang of Eight, right, is the proper oversight body for these sorts of secrets. But I don't see any argument to be made that the Gang of Eight is more likely to leak than, a deputy for Strategic Air Command, right? These are human beings. They take the same oaths. They're subject to the same human frailties, right? Money, ideology, compromise, ego. This is how intelligence services recruit. And so every service has to approach these things with a balance of risks to manage.
Okay, I accept all that, Matthew, but this is the thing I wrestle with the most when I'm looking at this issue. Journalists have this assumption, sooner or later, everything leaks. Politicians can't help themselves. They're total gossips. Okay, so let's assume a decision was made by people in the national security establishment at a very high level, and people colluded in private aerospace to keep it secret. They must know that at some stage it's going to leak. I mean, what's the rationale if they knew that? Why have they persisted with this cover-up?
Well, leaking information doesn't necessarily mean programs are compromised, right? Those are sometimes very different things. And you can mitigate leak of information through selective disinformation programs, right? That's, I think, been the main strategy, right? Like, information often does leak out of highly classified programs, but you can mitigate the impact by a successful disinformation effort. And so
that might explain things like MJ12, which does appear to have some legitimacy, but there is some apparent disinformation within that.
Yeah, and I think that's every program has to have that built in, right? You never assume everything's going to stay inside the box. You have to assume some information could get outside the box. And then your plan is how you staunch the bleeding, right? How you mitigate the impact of information leaking. And a lot of counterintelligence activities and intelligence activities is often trying to suss out from an adversary doing the same thing to you, what leaks are legitimate leaks, what leaks are sort of intentional misinformation from an adversary service that wants to feed you something, right, to confuse you. And I think we have been in this sub rosa Cold War with our principal geopolitical rivals, Russia and then now China on this subject, and we've been engaged in this sort of multi-party intelligence and counterintelligence activity on these programs. I think that's what motivates to first order the security organizations that protect this information is not congressional reporting, which is like 5 layers above their head. It's Chinese spies trying to get in. And I think they've been very successful, unfortunately.
But I'll tell you that the biggest thing I get from people who speak to me and who convincingly assert that they're working within this legacy UAP reverse engineering program, the biggest concern that I get from them is that the very secrecy, the very compartmentalization that's imposed on them as scientists and people investigating the phenomenon is actually confounding our ability to develop advantages in technology and materials science that might give us the edge over our foreign rivals, whereas at the same time, apparently, China is moving ahead with leaps and bounds.
I think it's a very fair assessment. I have the same concern. I've in my last role, which I just departed, had spent 4 years essentially advising multinationals and critical technology companies on essentially, to first order China trying to hack them or otherwise access their proprietary information. And it's gotten to the point where China doesn't necessarily need to steal a whole lot because they're actually out front of many of our leading technology companies. I mean, there's certain fields where we have an advantage, but China is extremely capable at pushing the frontier along a lot of these relevant dimensions, whether it's material science, quantum information sciences, and related quantum sort of technology applications, space, new energy. They are extremely capable. And if you wedded that strong S&T capability and massive R&D pipeline coming out of the universities into a military system that has civil military fusion, where there's no such thing as really like a private tech company or a private R&D enterprise. Ultimately, the state can subsume your activities.
So the implications of this, I just want to emphasize this for our audience because it's a complex idea, but essentially the idea is that the very secrecy that's been imposed on this alleged UAP reverse engineering program, a secret attempt by the US government and private aerospace to reverse engineer non-human technology and give America a strategic advantage against its potential foreign rivals, that whole idea is potentially being undermined by that secrecy. Whereas at the same time, the countries in which we're involved, is, according to David Grush, in a secret sub-rosa Cold War for the development of these technologies, they've got authoritarian governments. They can repress people and intimidate scientists all they want to achieve the results that they want to achieve. We're actually undermining our ability to secure a strategic advantage.
Yeah, and even the Senate put this in writing, and the sort of front matter for one of the recent bills. They said, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the federal government must broaden awareness of historic exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes, which kind of tells the whole thing. It means in order to mitigate the possibility of China getting the jump on us, the federal government must broaden awareness of these historical exotic technology antecedents that we had previously provided for R&D purposes. And that is now not sufficient.
So we've got that point emphasized now. That being the case, my concern about the task force, the UAP task force that has been set up by Congresswoman Anna Portolina Luna, is they're good people, they're well-motivated people, and they're on both sides of politics, but they're fairly junior level members in the House. They're not heads of committees. James Comer, for example, has conspicuously not put himself onto that task force subcommittee, if you like. Mm-hmm. Where's Marco Rubio on this? Where are all the people who've previously basically made it clear that they've taken a position on the UAP issue? Why are they so quiet right now? Why hasn't Trump said anything more overtly?
So this is where I put my other different hats on that I've worn. One is like the geopolitical risk analyst. The other is as a student of the global economic system and sort of the power structures that govern our world and the global order that has evolved over the past decades. And you have to think about the national strategic policy decision calculus around UAP disclosure, not on its own, individual terms, but in this larger strategic and global context. And that's where you think about a lot of things that are happening that are quite significant and strategic in terms of the global chessboard, right? Trump, aggressively and somewhat to the dismay of the Europeans, pushing for a ceasefire deal in Ukraine, sort of snuffing out the flames of conflict in Europe, making pretty just dramatic, moves, and then getting most of the Middle East to come along for a resolution of the Israel-Gaza conflict. And then even suggestions to China and Russia mutually that we should reduce our defense expenditures by 50% and maybe even embark on a program of denuclearization. Meanwhile, Rubio is sent as his principal, avatar to go negotiate these deals. And I look at that and I look at this is obviously a massive geopolitical shift in terms of U.S. foreign policy. But I also have to consider the UAP topic, and Rubio knows what he knows, and you know what Rubio knows, right? So he's going into these meetings with Lavrov, and future meetings with world leaders, and they know what he knows about this subject. So this is not some side question on some podcasts. This is, lurking, maybe even explicitly in side conversations between national leaders and their foreign emissaries. And this is where the discussion around disclosure fundamentally is a global discussion, right? It's about, what this means for these larger questions about the systems of government and the foreign relations that, we want to try to keep stable.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the Russians and the Chinese know full well that there is a non-human intelligence engaging with this planet?
No, they know just as much as we know. And that's the unfortunate part.
Why would they collude then with the United States and keeping it secret? I mean, if you were Putin, if you wanted to sort of embarrass the government of the United States, wouldn't one of the best ways to do that be to say, listen, you guys are always accusing me of being the authoritarian, but it's your country that's suppressing evidence of a non-human intelligence. Why wouldn't the Russians disclose?
I think it's been a complicated game theory that has maybe kept that sort of suppressed in a mutually reinforcing, somewhat stable equilibrium, right? Where everyone had an interest in trying to keep it secret from their own public, right? Because there could be second order effects that would destabilize their regime stability, as well as, you want to try to keep enough of your knowledge close to the chest. You know that the other guy knows something about it, but you don't really know exactly how much they've figured out either about the technology, the origin, or these other interrelated phenomena. And so you do sort of a double game, right? You want to try to cooperate to the extent that you can want to glean some information of your adversary. How much do they know, right? What do they know that I don't know? So you want to cooperate because there's an exogenous variable here that neither of you potentially perfectly model. So other people's information is very valuable to you, but you don't want to, reveal all the things you've got. So this is a complicated dynamic that maybe kept a lid on sort of public disclosure. But maybe we might be shifting to a new regime where that dynamic could shift. And there has been concern. I know it's been voiced to me in different settings that, maybe not Russia, but China, for example, feels like they have, gotten enough of knowledge around this subject that this would be in line with their strategic communications and sort of global propaganda goals, right? That they can sort of come out and say, blame the sort of imperial West for holding the secret illegally and morally from the world in order to exploit it for, material and military advantage. Meanwhile, we, who've just recently come into this knowledge, we have studied it. Our best scientists have, looked into this subject, and we want to bring this knowledge to the world. And we want to then also use the fruits of our R&D to bring the gifts of the technology that could be generated and share those with the world, right? It would be a massive propaganda victory, right, for their whole sort of shared.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so sort of shared future for mankind, a kind of a common destiny, sorts of sort of verbiage that they've been propagating. So this is a massive risk. This is why the disclosure conversation isn't just the U.S. one, right? There's a dynamic here of it was maybe a stable equilibrium that kept it somewhat under wraps, especially when it was just U.S. and Russia. Now there's a new party, and they've caught up, and they have a much larger ambition. And maybe they're not as worried about the domestic or destabilizing effects in their own society, maybe because of different metaphysical basis in their belief system, or other considerations. So this is a new regime we could be entering into.
Separately from the allegations of David Grush, Lou Elizondo, all the known people, Jake Barber, Have you, in your time trawling the halls of power, chatting quietly with senators and congresspeople, have you ever heard the whispers that there is this program in operation, this reverse engineering program with retrieved non-human technology?
I mean, I've heard, again, it's like there's an elephant and you touch a tail, you touch a toe, you touch a tusk, and you're like, I think this is an elephant, but nobody comes out and says it's an elephant, right? It's a very unusual tusk. It's a very unusual tail, right? So there's obviously individuals that are in the public domain, the folks that have come out, spoken at Soul Foundation, that have made the clear and declarative, allegation of these programs, and those folks have the bona fides, and I'm very confident in the quality and the source of their assertions. But it also comports with other information that I've gleaned in various more snippets, right, of that elephant that generally paint this mosaic of, yes, like these are longstanding, I think somewhat fragmented, compartmentalized programs that exist across a smattering of different defense primes, and then are custodied in a variety of different locations. And this is an active program at scale that's been long running.
One thing that I was told by a very good source was that Israel is much more intimately involved in the legacy program than has previously been disclosed to date. Have you ever heard any intimations of the Israelis being involved?
I mean, well, there's the famous, sort of Haim Ashed book where he alleges that. I haven't heard anything firsthand about that. I strongly suspect it. And recently, I was in a conversation with, and this is recorded, so it'll be public, that will basically describe kind of someone very connected to Israel, talking about the subject. And it relates, in general to, what we think about, the Israeli military complex and how close it was to the U.S. Complex. And, we have embarked on kind of a sensitive relationship with Israel over the years, right? Like we have very sensitive technology transfer programs with them. They also have very sensitive technology transfer programs with us because they often have breakthroughs that we don't get because they're extremely good. But of course, they live in a much more volatile environment, right? So they would have an acute interest in, operationalizing some capabilities that maybe we would much more like to hold back, right? For say a really covert ISR thing. So there's an inherent risk associated with, Israel's programs, like leading to disclosure of some advancements, because their threshold for operational deployment is going to be much, say, lower than ours, right? But no, I strongly suspect that most governments of some advancement, essentially, I expect that almost every government that has a nuclear program probably has something like a UAP program, at different stages of maturity and understanding. But I don't think it's actually like that much of a there's that much of a monopoly, around the great powers.
I've spent a lot of time looking at the extraordinary claims made by, of all people, rock star Tom DeLonge. And I actually think Tom's telling a very true story, that essentially in the years prior to the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump first election campaign challenge, there was a decision made by people in the Defense Department and private aerospace that they'd better get out on the front foot. And they were preparing for disclosure. And that as much as revealed in the WikiLeaks document that clearly show that Clinton's campaign advisor, John Podesta, who was obviously at senior levels in both Bill Clinton's White House and Barack Obama's White House, he was heavily involved in conversations with a very senior executive from Lockheed Martin, with people, General Neil McCaslin from the US Air Force, General Michael Carey from the US Air Force, and there appeared to be some kind of strategic planning for what was essentially seen as a likely Hillary Clinton victory, the possibility or the probability that there was going to be a disclosure precedent pushing for disclosure. Do you agree with that analysis? Do you think that we came very close in 2017 to a possible disclosure presidency that was confounded by Donald Trump winning in 2017?
Yes, no, I would concur with your assessment. And I would even connect it to something Jake Barber mentioned. I think it was in Jesse Michaels' interview, where he described, maybe with speculation on his part, about the origin of the program that he was sort of recruited into as being, created at the behest of President Clinton. And my sort of interpolation of that, this is me sort of speculating on top of that, is that if President Clinton had come into office with some broad but very much vague awareness of these programs and wanted to get to the bottom of it and tasks his senior advisors to go out and say, I'm the president, this is, what president, this is what I want to know, and he gets the stiff arm, well, he would be concerned, right, that there's a rogue programs out there. Well, then you might want to be like, well, what can I do as president? I can just meekly accept that, or you can create your own secret programs off the books to try to get the read on what these other secret programs that they're not telling you about are doing. And this is like, it sounds somewhat, exaggerated, but it's kind of what you would expect bureaucratically, right? Is just you just sign a memo, and now you've got a whole new secret program that just reports to you. And presidents, that's like one of the special things you can do as president. And that sort of would involve this process of kind of slow infiltration, if not collaboration, and kind of a very complicated kind of bureaucratic evolution from there. But it would be a response that I would have as president if I had high confidence that these programs existed, to like get some my own intelligence on maybe what parts of my apparatus are doing without my knowledge, and that maybe have collected information that led ultimately to the part two.
But the corollary to what we're talking about here is that clearly when Donald Trump did become president in defiance of what was being predicted, it was a huge upset even to the mainstream media. It's quite clear a decision was made inside the national security establishment to not disclose that President Trump wasn't a disclosure president. Has anything changed? I mean, Trump's a very transactional person. What's in it for Trump to disclose?
Well, this is where I'm speculating, but I think ultimately there's individuals like presidents, and then there's a political economy and a political structure around that president. And I think the political economy, like the political structure, the elite figures, the factions that support President Trump are very different now than they were in 2017. And I looked at the motivations and the objectives of that entire collection of elite interests that are around the president, that are now aggressively moving the federal bureaucracy, breaking the federal bureaucracy in some ways, and want to also, in the same fashion, in sort of Silicon Valley disruption era, like break up a lot of these institutional structures that you could imagine kind of have encased in different sort of carapaces the legacy program, right? And whether it's an objective to get at the legacy program, right, or whether it's just an incidental discovery along the way, I don't know. But I think there's a lot of folks out in Silicon Valley that are interested in the subject, that have, I think, a bead on the subject, and would be very curious to sort of get to ground truth. And I would look to, say, Representative Gallagher, who in another era, right, would be the type of guy that would go to be on the board of Lockheed, right, or would get tapped to be a private equity guy at Carlyle Group. Instead, he goes to become head of defense at Palantir, right? That's just sort of me an indication of the shifting power dynamic in U.S. political economy, where now these defense contractors now, right, Anduril, Palantir, a whole host of AI companies that are now very close to the security state, have the power, have the technological capabilities, probably have like the young talent, the brains, and the political juice now in DC to sort of call the shots. And the legacy defense primes that used to hold, congressmen, kind of somewhat hostage, right, maybe have lost the juice. And that ultimately is what shifts disclosure structures, is when you have the political system respond to very different centers of power. And I think there could be other consequences of that. But that to me is why Trump 2.0 is just fundamentally different on the subject than 1.0.
You're giving me reason for optimism, Matthew.
Optimism, pessimism, I don't know. I'm an analyst and a realist. I try to be a pragmatist. I don't know what scenario is optimal here. I just think we're heading towards a pattern of disclosure that's, in my view, fundamentally more like there's controlled disclosure, catastrophic disclosure that people talk about. I think it's more like a chaotic disclosure, kind of this ping pong ball, and disclosure is a process of social sense making. It's not like the release of information, it's the absorption and integration of information into worldviews. And that requires people being ready to have the conversation and to incorporate different levels of this into their worldviews. It isn't just a simple, there's craft that can do things that we can't do. It's a much more complicated, shift in people's understanding of reality.
I mean, there are very legitimate economic concerns too, aren't there? I mean, a large number of the top 100 on the US stock exchange would be dependent on the success of fossil fuels as the primary energy imperative for the world. Imagine if energy was discovered to be freely obtainable from ZPE, zero-point energy, quantum vacuum energy. Imagine if that allegation is true, wouldn't it mean that the entire stock exchange of the United States would probably drop dramatically in value overnight?
Well, yes, there's lots of risks. There's financial stability risks. There's stranded asset risks that you just talked about. There is a much more social, much more, I'd say, strategic risk associated with people's inability to discount the future, right? Because even if you had free energy, right, it takes a while to maybe transition that into society, right? You could, depending on the nature of the engineering that's required, et cetera, before you get the energy return on energy investment payoff from that. It could be a dramatic civilizational change, but it might not be an overnight shift. And that inherent uncertainty, right, is what breaks the financial models governing all asset pricing, right? Like the 30-year treasury note, right, is sort of pricing in a smoothly discounted, time value of money. And if that is now subject to a radical uncertainty, now people really can't price out anything into the future. People stop. They don't know how to save. Most asset prices in the world now can't fundamentally be priced. And that's not just the top 100, literally every asset, right? Real estate, mortgages, like everything just basically comes to a halt. You couldn't essentially have a pricing mechanism in that type of scenario, which is truly disruptive, right? Which is why I think you need to have, on the technology side, I think it'll be I don't think there's like a snap your finger, a new technology that fundamentally changes the paradigm. That is a risk I'm paying attention to, but I think there's other financial stability risks associated just with like the event of disclosure or that transition period where kind of the preference falsification and the cascade triggers, and that uncertainty is maximal. And then you need to reduce that uncertainty as quickly as possible so that people can then price the future in something like a consistent way. And that's how you get financial markets, is to price the future.
So Matthew, final question. I want you to put on your crystal ball. What's going to happen? Are we going to see big D disclosure, or is this all going to be swept under the carpet for another 30 years?
I'm never 100%. I think we are on an irreversible path towards the reality of non-human intelligence being a subject of mass awareness. I don't know exactly how soon, but I think that's an irreversible process at this point. And yeah, it's just a matter of the path to that point. Yeah.
Well, I think we'd put on our seatbelts and it's going to be a bumpy ride. But Matthew Pines, thank you so much for giving us your analysis on Reality Check. Look forward to having you on again sometime. And good luck in your new role with the Bitcoin Institute. Maybe one day you can explain to us why we should all buy cryptocurrency. I'm not yet convinced.
I think these are more related subjects than you would imagine.
Thanks very much, Matty.
Thanks for having me.
We're also going to start doing questions and answers. So if you'd like to send your questions, please, to realitycheck@newsnationnow.com. And you can also catch the show at midnight Eastern on Saturday evenings. See you then.